Mark Davis made the fatal mistake of drinking and flying, which would end up in the deaths of him and his friends. The story picks up while they are all in the airport bar, relaxing before what would end up becoming their last flight. Inside the airport bar, Mark raised his third beer in a toast to his friends. Sarah Thompson, her nurse's scrubs still visible under her jacket, watched him with growing concern. Next to her, Tom Chen from IT scrolled through his phone, showing Mike Anderson pictures of the mountain routes they might take. The four friends had gathered to celebrate Tom's recent promotion, and Mark had insisted on making it special with a sunset flight. "Trust me, I've flown these mountains 100 times, Mark declared, his voice carrying across the bar. "The Cessna handles like a dream up there. It's all about knowing your aircraft and trusting your instincts." He gestured expansively, nearly knocking over his empty glass. Sarah leaned forward, her voice low but firm. "Mark, maybe we should postpone. The weather report mentioned—" "Unexpected turbulence?" Mark scoffed, cutting her off. "That's just the weather service being overcautious. I know these skies better than any meteorologist sitting in their office." Mike exchanged a worried glance with Sarah. As a middle school teacher, he recognized the dangerous combination of arrogance and impaired judgment in Mark's behavior. But Mark had always been this way, pushing boundaries, taking risks, and somehow coming out on top. The television mounted above the bar flickered with a local weather update. The meteorologist pointed to a complex pattern of air currents moving through the mountain passes, emphasizing the potential for severe turbulence. Mark didn't even glance at the screen, too busy regaling Tom with stories of his most daring flights. Through the bar's windows, the mountains loomed magnificent and merciless. The setting sun painted their peaks in brilliant oranges and deep purples, a deceptively peaceful scene that masked the treacherous air currents flowing between them. A small plane took off, its engines drone carrying faintly through the glass. Sarah watched Mark order another round, her stomach tightening with apprehension. She'd seen too many preventable tragedies in her emergency room rotations, all starting with moments just like this. Moments when speaking up felt impossible, when the momentum of bad decisions seemed unstoppable. "Last call before we head out," Mark announced, standing up perhaps a bit too quickly. "Who's ready for the most beautiful sunset flight of their lives?" The late afternoon light slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across their faces. In the distance, the mountains waited, silent and indifferent to the drama unfolding beneath them, as the group prepared to make a decision that would change their lives forever. The walk to the airfield felt longer than usual, with Sarah and Mike trailing several steps behind Mark and Tom. The setting sun painted the small Cessna 182 Skylane in amber hues, its white and blue trim gleaming against the darkening sky. Mark approached his aircraft with the casual familiarity of someone greeting an old friend. "She's a beauty, isn't she?" Mark patted the plane's nose, fumbling slightly with his keys as he unlocked the door. "Just got her detailed last week." The Skylane's sleek profile belied its impressive capabilities, a four-seater single-engine aircraft designed for both reliability and performance. But tonight, its polished exterior couldn't mask Sarah's growing unease as she watched Mark rush through his pre-flight checklist. "Fuel levels. Check," Mark muttered, barely glancing at the gauge. He skipped the thorough walk-around inspection that Sarah had seen him perform countless times before, instead jumping straight to the cabin checks. Mike stepped forward, his teacher's instinct for responsibility pushing through his usual easygoing nature. "Mark, maybe I should—" It's fine, Tom interrupted, clapping Mike on the shoulder. "Mark knows what he's doing. This is going to be epic." Inside the cabin, Mark flipped switches and adjusted dials with practiced movements, though his fingers weren't quite as precise as usual. The instrument panel lit up, casting a green glow across his face as he settled into the pilot's seat. Sarah noticed him skip the weather radio check entirely. "Everyone buckle up," Mark called out cheerfully, his words slightly slurred. For a brief moment, something flickered across his face. A shadow of doubt, perhaps, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. He gripped the yoke with both hands, his knuckles whitening slightly. The engine roared to life, drowning out any further protests. Sarah clicked her seatbelt with trembling fingers, while Tom practically bounced with excitement in his seat. Mike sat rigid, his face a mask of forced calm. As they taxied toward the runway, the control tower's voice crackled through the radio with clearance instructions. Mark responded with practiced phrases, his professional pilot's voice at odds with his earlier bar behavior. The plane aligned with the runway, its nose pointing toward the mountains that loomed ever larger in the windscreen. The engine's pitch increased as Mark pushed the throttle forward. The Cessna gathered speed, its wheels rumbling against the tarmac until, with a slight pull on the yoke, they were airborne. The ground fell away beneath them as they climbed into the darkening sky, leaving the safety of the airport behind. Mark's face broke into a triumphant grin as they ascended. "See? Smooth as silk," he declared, either ignoring or not noticing how the plane wavered slightly in its climb. The last rays of sunlight caught the aircraft's wings as they banked toward the mountains, embarking on a journey from which there would be no return. The Cessna climbed steadily through the mountain air, its wings catching the last golden rays of sunset. Below them, the Rockies spread out in a magnificent tapestry of peaks and valleys, their rugged beauty both enchanting and intimidating in the fading light. "Check out that view," Tom exclaimed, pressing his face against the window. "You can see all the way to Yellowstone from here." Mark banked the plane slightly, showing off the panorama. "Nothing beats Montana from 5,000 feet, he said, his words still carrying a slight slur. The aircraft shuddered as it hit a pocket of turbulence, causing Sarah to grip her armrest tighter. The cabin's atmosphere shifted as the first serious bumps rattled through the frame. The Cessna, lightweight by design, responded dramatically to each air current. Mark compensated by pulling back on the yoke, but his movements were exaggerated, making the ride even choppier. "That's some weather system moving in," Mike observed, pointing to the dark mass of clouds gathering between the peaks ahead. The setting sun cast ominous shadows through them, creating a maze of light and darkness that would challenge even a sober pilot's depth perception. Mark ignored the warning signs flashing on his instrument panel. The altimeter fluctuated wildly as mountain winds tossed the small aircraft around. His alcohol-impaired reflexes caused him to overcompensate for each disturbance, creating a dangerous pendulum effect in their flight path. "Maybe we should turn back," Sarah suggested, her medical training making her acutely aware of Mark's deteriorating performance. She noticed his delayed reactions, the slight confusion in his eyes as he scanned the instruments, the way he squinted to focus on the gauges. "Just some mountain waves," Mark dismissed, though his forehead beaded with sweat. "The sky lane can handle anything these hills throw at us." Another violent shake rattled through the cabin, sending an empty water bottle rolling across the floor. The altimeter showed they were losing altitude, but Mark seemed oblivious. The vertical speed indicator dipped into the red, its warning beep barely audible over the engine's strain. Tom's excited chatter had ceased, replaced by nervous glances between the passengers. Sarah watched Mark's hands on the controls, noting how they trembled slightly. Every aviation safety article she'd ever read flashed through her mind. Alcohol's effects on spatial awareness, decision-making, and reaction time multiplied significantly at altitude. The thin mountain air only amplified these impairments. "Mark, the heading indicator," Mike started, but Mark cut him off with a sharp gesture. "I know these mountains like the back of my hand," he snapped, though his eyes betrayed uncertainty as he struggled to maintain their course through the darkening sky. The sun had nearly disappeared now, leaving them in the treacherous twilight where depth perception became increasingly unreliable. The turbulence intensified as they threaded between peaks, the Cessna bucking like a wild horse. Warning lights flickered across the instrument panel, their urgent messages ignored by Mark's alcohol-clouded judgment. The mountain winds howled around them, finding every vulnerability in their small aircraft's frame. Sarah felt her heart race as she realized they were flying too low, too fast, and too recklessly through terrain that demanded respect and precision. The once beautiful mountain vista had transformed into a maze of shadowy threats, each peak a potential executioner waiting in the gathering darkness. The first serious warning came as a shrill beep from the instrument panel. The stall warning indicator flashed red, but Mark's alcohol-dulled reflexes failed to respond quickly enough. The Cessna shuddered violently as another gust of wind slammed into its side, sending them into a steep bank. "We're too low," Sarah screamed, watching the altimeter spin downward. The rocky mountainside loomed terrifyingly close through the passenger window, its jagged features now clearly visible in the dimming light. Mark yanked the yoke back hard, forcing the plane's nose up. "Just need to get some altitude," he muttered, his words thick and uncertain. The engine whined in protest as he pushed it beyond its limits, trying to climb too steeply in the thin mountain air. Mike leaned forward from the back seat, his teacher's calm voice cracking with urgency. "Mark, let me help. We need to turn around now." He reached for the co-pilot controls, but Mark shouldered him away. "Don't touch anything," Mark snapped, his face shining with sweat. "I can handle this." The plane lurched again, and Tom let out a frightened gasp as his phone flew from his hands, clattering somewhere in the back. The Cessna's instruments painted a dire picture. The altimeter showed them dropping despite the nose-up attitude. The airspeed indicator dipped dangerously low, and the vertical speed indicator showed they were losing altitude at an alarming rate. But Mark's alcohol-impaired brain couldn't process all these warnings simultaneously. Sarah, her medical training kicking in, recognized the signs of severe spatial disorientation in Mark's behavior. "We're going to stall!" she shouted, pointing at the flashing warning lights. "Level the wings! Push the nose down!" But Mark's overconfidence, amplified by alcohol, led him to trust his failing instincts over the instruments and his friend's warnings. He pulled back even harder on the yoke, convinced they could climb over the approaching ridge. The mountain's dark mass filled the windscreen, its peaks barely visible in the fading light. The stall warning horn blared continuously now, its urgent cry mixing with the engine's labored roar. The Cessna shuddered violently as it approached the critical angle of attack. The thin mountain air offered little lift, and the plane's wings struggled against the physics of their situation. "Mark, please!" Sarah's voice cracked with desperation. "We need to turn back!" But her words were lost in the cacophony of warnings and the roaring engine. Tom had fallen silent in the back seat, his earlier excitement replaced by paralyzed fear. Mike continued trying to reach for the controls, his teacher's instinct to protect overwhelming his own terror. The plane bucked and shuddered, fighting against Mark's increasingly erratic inputs. The mountain's shadow engulfed them as they approached the rocky face. Mark's alcohol-impaired judgment couldn't process the rapidly closing distance between them and the jagged peaks. He remained convinced they could climb over the ridge even as the plane's instruments screamed warnings. Suddenly, the aircraft's nose dropped despite Mark's desperate attempts to keep it up. The wings lost their lift and the plane entered a full stall. For a horrifying moment, they hung suspended in the air, defying gravity. Time seemed to slow as the Cessna rolled to the left, its wings no longer generating enough lift to keep them airborne. The engine screamed as Mark pushed it to full power, but it was too late. The mountain filled their entire view now, its rocky face rushing toward them with terrifying speed. Sarah's last conscious thought was of the voicemail she'd left for her sister just before takeoff. Mike reached desperately for the controls, but his movements were futile. Tom's scream mixed with the shriek of twisting metal as the Cessna's wing caught the mountainside. The impact came with a deafening crash. The aircraft's momentum carried it forward, tearing through trees and rocks as it disintegrated. The cockpit crumpled inward, the windows exploded, and the fuel tanks ruptured. In mere seconds, the proud Cessna 182 Skylane was transformed into a scattered trail of wreckage across the mountainside, its 4 occupants silenced forever by one pilot's fatal mistake. And the mountain winds continued to howl through the wreckage, carrying away the last echoes of the crash into the gathering darkness. The once beautiful sunset flight had become a testament to the deadly combination of alcohol, overconfidence, and the unforgiving nature of mountain flying. The wreckage lay scattered across the mountainside like a twisted metal jigsaw puzzle. In the eerie silence following the crash, only the mountain winds whistled through the shattered remnants of the Cessna. The acrid smell of aviation fuel mixed with burning metal hung heavy in the cold mountain air, while emergency beacons pierced the darkness with their rhythmic flashing. The first sign something was wrong came when the plane failed to arrive at its scheduled time. Air traffic controllers, following standard procedures, initiated emergency protocols, alerting search and rescue services. The Civil Air Patrol, ironically often the ones conducting such searches themselves, now became the subject of a desperate rescue effort. As night fell, search and rescue teams battled the challenging mountain terrain, guided by the aircraft's last known coordinates and emergency locator transmitter signals. The Colorado Army National Guard deployed helicopters equipped with thermal imaging, their searchlights cutting through the darkness as they scanned the mountainside. The wreckage was discovered shortly after dawn. The scene told a brutal story of the plane's final moments. The initial impact point where the wing caught the ridge, followed by a trail of debris that stretched several hundred yards across the rocky slope. The cockpit had crumpled on impact, leaving no chance of survival for those inside. Among the personal effects scattered across the crash site, rescuers found Sarah's phone, still displaying her final unanswered voicemail to her sister. The message, now a haunting testament to the evening's events, would later become crucial evidence in the crash investigation. Back in Bozeman, the news spread quickly through the tight-knit aviation community. Families gathered at the airport, clinging to diminishing hope as the hours passed. When confirmation finally came, the impact rippled through the community. Parents lost children, partners lost soulmates, and friends lost confidants in a single moment of tragic misjudgment. The families faced not just emotional devastation, but practical challenges too. Beyond the immediate grief, they confronted funeral arrangements, legal proceedings, and the painful task of sorting through their loved ones' belongings. The airport bar where the fateful decision was made became a somber reminder of how quickly life can change. For the rescue teams who responded to the crash, the scene joined countless others etched in their memories. Another reminder of the unforgiving nature of mountain flying and the devastating consequences of impaired judgment. The wreckage would remain on the mountainside for days as investigators documented every detail, trying to piece together the final moments of flight that ended in tragedy. The FAA's final report painted a damning picture of the events leading to the crash. Mark Davis's blood alcohol level tested at 0.12%, more than 3 times the legal limit for operating an aircraft. The investigation revealed a series of fatal errors compounded by impaired judgment and deteriorating weather conditions. Mechanical analysis of the wreckage showed the Cessna had been in perfect working order before impact. Every warning system had functioned correctly, from the stall indicator to the altitude alerts. The tragedy, investigators concluded, resulted purely from human error and poor decision-making. Statistics embedded in the report highlighted a sobering truth. Alcohol-related incidents accounted for 12% of all fatal aviation accidents in private aircraft. Mark's case joined these grim statistics, becoming a cautionary tale taught in flight schools across the country. At the memorial service held at the crash site 1 year later, families and friends gathered to remember the 4 lives lost. They erected a small plaque on the mountainside, its bronze surface catching the same sunset light that had illuminated the Cessna's final flight. The inscription read simply, "In memory of 4 friends who reached for the sky, may their story remind us that safety must always come first." The Bozeman aviation community changed after the crash. The airport bar closed, replaced by a flight safety center. Local pilots established a volunteer program teaching students about responsible decision-making and the dangers of impaired flying. The program, named Sarah's Warning, after her unheeded concerns that night, serves as a lasting reminder that sometimes the bravest decision a pilot can make is to stay on the ground. As the sun sets over the Rockies each evening, casting long shadows across the airport runway, new pilots learn from this tragedy. They learn that the thin line between adventure and disaster often comes down to one decision, one moment of overconfidence, one choice that can never be undone.